you with it, drop it.
Sakarib. One of the biggest myths about Israel-Palestine conflict that has been going on for centuries that is all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, the conflict is mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes about century. To the early 90s, around then, the region along the Western Mediterranean we now call is Israel-Palestine had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It was religious diverse including mostly Muslims and Christians, but also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. And it was changing the two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just an ethnic Arabs but Palestinian, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not a religion but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed Jewish state was their only way of safety, and they saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of 20th century, tens of thousands European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the British-French empires carved up the Middle East, with the British control of a region it called the British and Mandate of Palestine. At first, British allowed Jewish immigration but as more as Jewish arrived, setting into farming communes tension between Jews and Arab groups. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and the resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as a certain violence between Arabs and Jews, there grew the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem were Jews, Muslim, and Christians, all of holy sites. It was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British should no longer control. Jews accepted the plan and declared independence as Israel, but Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states who had just recently won independence themselves declared war on Israel is an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of the Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge number of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number of about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's next of the Jordan's River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in the Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled. Arriving in Israel, then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had served the Golan Heights for Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of the Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords and a peace treaty. At the same time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egypt President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in the part of because of outrage against it, but it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this was when the conflict became an Israel-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed on what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut. The PLO later said that it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine. But the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These peoples are called settlers and made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Something moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land of Israel, and some just because housing is cheap, and often subsidized by the some just because of the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities and with thousands of people, others are small communities. The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlement force Palestinians off their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinians' land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state.
Reducing Gaza to rubble. Israel says a week and a half of this has decimated Hamas's tunnel network. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Hamas's military infrastructure has been set back years. But the infrastructure the people of Gaza depend on is also in ruins. Lines destroyed, electricity only works 1 to 2 hours a day now. In many areas, fresh water is cut off completely. Hamas is still firing rockets toward Israel, but they've slowed down significantly. The Israeli city of Ashkelon, just 5 miles from Gaza, has borne the brunt of the rockets. So much so that at the main hospital, they've moved all the patients underground for safety.
The entire emergency ward here is built like a bunker. To enter it, you have to pass through this giant metal door, which can seal off the entire area.
Under thick, reinforced concrete, the hospital is now crowded and busy. They've treated 350 here wounded from rockets, on top of the normal workload, all now crammed into one small space.
What is it like to be operating in what is effectively a bunker?
So actually, this is the best way to feel like safe during all the bombs. I counted like a few days ago more than 80 alarms in 24 hours. All the hospitals is in the bunker.
It's so deep down here, you can't hear the air raid sirens above, by design. They don't want patients to be more stressed as they receive treatment and recover. So the children can only hear the clowns keeping their spirits up while the conflict continues overhead.
Israel is defending its military campaign. Netanyahu telling foreign ambassadors today that even the most precise military strikes risk collateral damage. Hoda?
All right, Richard Engel for us there in the region. Richard, thank you.